40. Chapter 631 Tanarden by Hydesgrain. Jason was still not sure how Pera and Jen hadn't been able to figure out that he had been a halfling without him exposing his identity. However, what he didn't know was the simple fact that all kinds of races existed and that it was quite common to come across extraordinary-looking beings. There were also those that looked like humans, only to be different, owing to different body parts of unique traits. As such, nobody could truly figure out that one was a halfling, except if one was able to use repulsive energies or affinities at the same time. This indicated that one possessed a unique constitution that allowed the wielder to use these energies and affinities at the same time. In the end, there were also other possibilities to be able to use multiple energies or repulsive affinities at once, and Jason just didn't know about it yet. His mind and behavior had been conditioned according to the surroundings on Argos, where every race including the infiltrating races were well known. Jason had yet to understand that it was completely different on Mana, where everything, including one's race, was much more difficult to determine. Nevertheless, his initial assumption about Jennifer being a halfling had been correct, and his revelation about being a halfling himself eased the tension she had been feeling before. With his golden silverish eyes, and his aura and stigma fully unleashed, Jason's demeanor had changed completely, and Jen recalled the short moment she had been distracted by the young man, several months ago. However, instead of mentioning it, she preferred to remain silent about her identity and thanked Pera for the potions before she bid them farewell. Seeing Jason's innocent smile and his kind aura, Jen felt bad about the fact that he would be punished for entering the City Lord's abode. Should I make a short detour and see my master for a moment? While Jen asked the doubt to herself, Pera averted her attention from the young woman who left through the halfway, which connected the auxiliary tower with the main building. Looking at Jason, she smiled craftily. The moment he saw this, Jason couldn't help but take a step back, only to bump into the table behind him as he heard Pera ask. From the looks of it and your situation, I doubt that your punishment will be severe. As such, you can calm down and distract yourself. Do you want to forge a little bit? The cold-looking Eos you met earlier told me that you made an inscription solution and that you wanted to forge a weapon. Can I see what you made? Considering that Pera was called a crazy woman, she was able to easily adapt to the situation without sounding crazy at all. Rather, Jason found that she was quite normal if one were to exclude the comment she made earlier. With that in mind, he took the bright red dagger out of his spatial ring. The dagger had slightly darker red runes inscribed on the bright red blade, which made them barely visible. However, that was not an important aspect of the dagger. Its appearance was far from perfect, but Jason was fully aware of the same. The more interesting aspect of the dagger was the fact that the main ingredients to forge the weapon were fire attributed. With the fire elemental crystal as the main ingredient of the inscription solution, and the fire element ore as the only metal used to forge the blade, the dagger had become a tool that was fully focused on enhancing the fire attribute. Because of that, Jason released a faint trace of mana into the dagger which heated it up as a rune ignited. A moment later, sparks flew and a flame erupted from the dagger's tip before the entire weapon was enveloped in a thin membrane of flames. Seeing this, Pera was immediately interested but also confused because Jason was obviously much younger to achieve this feat than one would normally be. She had long since released her mana currents to investigate Jason so that nothing unexpected could happen. He had noticed her move, but he didn't feel the need to waste his energy to prevent someone who was merely 2 stages above him, from figuring out who he was and how old he was according to his bone age. Even if Jason wanted to exert his energy in putting up a defense, the mana currents of someone at the Ascendian stage could simply squash him, if Pera wanted to. Thus, he remained silent as Pera asked in confusion. You were able to forge a weapon out of fire-attributed Tanarden ore. And you are yet to turn 20. That's uncommon, to put it in extremely simple terms. Jason only smiled at this before he replied. One could say that I emerged inside a cave that had this ore, and elemental crystals all at one place. I have some with better quality, and at the Prisma rank too. Instead of lying, Jason decided to be honest with the people inside the City Lord's abode. There was no proper reason for him to do so, except his gut feeling guiding his actions to avoid receiving a painful punishment. Honesty should still hold some value, even more so in an era that was filled with lies, greed, and self-centered beings. Pera just nodded her head when she heard Jason, only to tilt her head a moment later. I guess you don't know the Tanardan ore, or you wouldn't tell me about the cave. To put it nicely, this ore is extremely important to forge certain weapons similar to the one you did. Because the cultivation paths of Prior and Spiral are unable to use affinities, beings with those cultivation paths are always searching for ways to utilize their cultivation energy to the limit of their capabilities. With your little weapon, even said beings could manifest a flame, and with enough practice maybe learn to conjure a fireball or other more dangerous things. After Pera said this, she extended her hand with her palm wide open, indicating Jason that he should hand over the dagger to her for a moment. He did as requested, and only a moment later she released some spiritual force, before inserting it into the dagger that began to heat up before a faint flame emerged from it. Detaching it from the dagger blade, Pera conjured an extremely small fireball before it dispersed. A moment later, Pera's face turned pale, draining her of all the color, which caused him to instinctively take a step forward. However, only a moment later, Pera's expression returned to normal as she mumbled, "I really shouldn't use spiritual force anymore." Jason had found her spiritual force weird since he'd seen her wield it with his Emperor eyes. At the same time, he could tell that her cultivation was at the Ascendian stage, but only in the path of Marist. Meanwhile, Pera's awakened spiral cultivation vein seemed to be damaged or malfunctioning because she hadn't cultivated in the spiral path. In the end, this was not something Jason should be bothered about, but somehow he felt sorry. She definitely didn't receive a blessing in disguise, that's more like bad luck in disguise. Chapter 632 Luna by Hydesgrain. Having awakened 2 cultivation veins should be something extremely good and praiseworthy, but to see that one of the 2 awakened veins was not working could only be described as shattering of a dream. Because of that, Jason felt a little bad for Pera, but then reminded himself that it would do him no good to poke his nose in others' business. While he was deep in thoughts, Jason was interrupted by Pera, who suddenly began to explain something to him. "You saw that, right? Even without using mana, let alone a fire affinity, I could manifest a small flame. The strength and versatility at which someone without a fire affinity can use the dagger made out of fire-attributed Tanardan metal is restricted, but the higher the ore's rank and quality, the smaller the restriction will become." Jason felt that this new information was extremely beneficial for him because the vast majority of his spatial rings were filled with elemental crystals and the Tanardan ore of multiple affinities. With this newfound information, he now felt that he should have stayed in the Cave of Elements for a little longer. Returning now would be a waste of time as his spatial rings were filled to the brim from his last excavation. As such, he had more than enough Tanardan ore and elemental crystals. Forging a proper weapon using each of the ores and crystals in his spatial ring would probably take years, but that did not matter because he would trade a few things, either way. Right now, he just wanted to forge, and improve his overall capabilities in all 3 auxiliary occupations. Unfortunately, Jason was required to purchase lots of ingredients to achieve this, and he was not allowed to leave right now. Thus, even forging weapons with anything else except the remaining vials of the fire-attributed inscription solution was not possible right now. This made him sigh, and when Pera asked him what was going on, Jason explained his situation. "Right now, my stock of materials has dwindled drastically. I only have Tanardan ores and elemental crystals stockpiled. As for the other ores I have, they're not exactly rare or difficult to forge with. I guess that means I'll have to continue using the fire-attributed Tanardan ore until I receive my punishment, so that I can leave to find a shop where I can look for the necessary ingredients." Jason sounded genuinely sad, which was apparent in his aura that turned gloomy, releasing a trace of sadness instead of the earlier kind and happy emotions. This caused Pera to smile lightly, thinking that Jason's aura was well connected to his range of emotions. She wanted to say that Jason could use her warehouse but suddenly remembered something. Before I can offer something, I should tell Luna that this youth is too talented to be punished severely. It would be a shame, even if he is only whipped 50 times or so with the energy ceiling whip. With that thought in mind, Pera couldn't help but think that she should try to prevent the City Lord from using her common prejudice against men to punish Jason. Trying to think of a solution for this issue, Pera got an idea not long after which made her look at Jason for a moment. I will have to go somewhere for a little while. Please do not hesitate to use anything you see here, but don't leave the auxiliary tower if possible, otherwise not only you will be punished but also I. Despite not being acquainted with Jason for a long time, the sincerity reflecting from him was crystal clear for Pera to see. It showed that he had not intentionally entered the City Lord's abode, let alone harbored any ill intention to assassinate her. He was way too weak for that and didn't have enough knowledge about too many things to see such a big task to its end. The things he had explained, his obvious confusion about the most basic things, and so on made it clear that he was not educated about mana, let alone one of the other older planets. Even on other planets, his knowledge would be deemed as below average, and only Jason's forging, alchemy, and inscription knowledge, or rather, innate talent was balancing out this lack of knowledge. Because of that, and the fact that Jason seemed to be a nice youth who was eager to find out more about the things he didn't know, Pera decided to pay a visit to the City Lord, Luna. Even if she was not sure if this would help, trying was not too much to ask for as Luna's punishment was severe and extremely painful to endure. While Pera left to meet Luna, Jason found himself all alone in the entire tower with tools and materials whose value he couldn't determine. However, that was not important to him because his eyes were glued to the floor, where his emperor eyes perceived the large library. She said I can use everything, right? He asked himself, with a faint smile on his face. Nodding faintly, he reassured himself. As such, Jason decided that it would be fine for him to enter the library, at least, he hoped so. With that in mind, he approached the stairway that led downwards only to arrive in front of a large, locked door. Under normal circumstances, Jason would have to know the exact configuration of the lock in order to open or the same energy fluctuations of those who had received permission to enter the library. This was extremely interesting, but not enough for him to stop in his tracks and take a proper look. He just wanted to read a few books and improve his knowledge. As such, using his Emperor eyes, he made use of the mana remnants of Pera's mana to unlock the door relatively easily. There was no concealment of the complex set of runes, and they were only hidden from the public eye, which, however, didn't include Jason's unique eyes and the ability to see energy fluctuations. As such, it was possible for him to open the door, and enter the library that was much larger than he had expected. It was extremely clean and small crystals lit up the inner chamber, the scent of old leather and paper, wafting through the air. This caused goosebumps to erupt all over his skin as the scent hit his nostrils the moment he stepped inside, invigorating him. He had always loved reading books and the library appeared to be no less than a treasure trove to him. After slipping inside, he quickly closed the door behind him, to preserve the books. The library had dense energy fluctuations that served as an additional factor to preserve the books, preventing them from decaying. They already had runes inscribed on them to prevent this, but it was always better to have an additional protection layer. Picking the first book that attracted his interest, Jason touched it gently before he opened it carefully. Even if Pera had allowed him free rein inside the auxiliary tower, he didn't want to damage anything. As such, after selecting a book, he looked around for a table and chair, to sit back and read comfortably. Only a moment later, sheets of paper and a pencil appeared in front of him. Jason knew that he wouldn't understand everything he read. As such, he wanted to jot down questions which he could ask Pera later. He knew that his punishment would be dealt with soon, but Jason wanted to make the punishment count. He wanted to take away something even if it was knowledge instead of simply getting beaten to a pulp for naught. Thus, he hoped that Pera would answer his questions. With that in mind, some time passed, in which Jason was able to read the first book while scribbling down a few questions on the piece of paper. He had been so engrossed in the act that he was alarmed to be suddenly interrupted by the dense mana currents of the being at the spectre stage he had perceived before. The City Lord is coming over, and her mana currents are volatile. That's bad. Chapter 633 Core Red-Handed by Hydesgrain. The moment Pera had left Jason, she began to look out for Luna, the City Lord. However, what she didn't expect to see the moment he found her in the main hall was that there were already 4 women speaking to her. It was Jen, and the 3 guards who had brought Jason to the auxiliary tower, and their reason to be there seemed to be the exact same as Pera's. This caused her to smile oddly, wondering how the young man had been able to convince all of them to help him, without doing anything at all. From the looks of it, Jason had simply accepted the punishment, even without knowing what it was. However, this was exactly the weird point that caused the others to be confused because it was an unordinary reaction. Under normal circumstances, one would give the best to prove their innocence or create a ruckus, but Jason was different. He simply accepted that he had erred, and instead of complaining, he simply awaited his fate at the hands of Luna while diverting his attention elsewhere. While any other person would have been sweating buckets and worried sick about the misery that would befall them, he focused on learning more about the auxiliary occupations, which was essentially the reason for Pera to approach the City Lord right now. The moment Pera entered the main hall, Luna, who had long since noticed her mana fluctuations, couldn't help but sigh. Please don't tell me that you are also here to request that the intruder get a light punishment. This caused Pera to halt in her tracks as she smiled dryly before she cleared her throat. I don't really think he is an intruder, but if you want to punish him as an intruder, then yes, I am here to ask for a lighter punishment for Jason. Sighing deeply, the City Lord looked at her disciple, who returned her gaze with a firm expression as if she wanted to say, "Trust me," before her attention returned to Pera. So, in order to tell me that the youth did not intrude my territory intentionally, you leave him alone in the auxiliary tower that is filled with the majority of the treasures we have acquired through centuries of hard work and sacrifice. Are you serious right now? Luna's voice was turning bitter with each spoken word, which made an involuntary chill run down Pera's spine. She couldn't help but feel goosebumps covering her body, while the feathers of her wings stiffened. Well, to put it simply, yes. But instead of pointing that out, look at that dagger. It's forged pretty well, and the young man used Tanardan ore for the first time in his life. Pera was holding out the dagger Jason had forged. She hadn't returned it to Jason, who was oblivious to the fact that she wanted to keep it for herself. Rather, he didn't care about it as he was already in the library at that time. Inspecting the weapon, Luna sighed once again as she said, "So, you think he is talented just because he forged such a weapon? Have your standards decreased, Pera? Don't tell me you want to take him in as an apprentice. Didn't you dislike the thought of having one after what had happened earlier?" Luna was slowly starting to become agitated about the young intruder, because everyone was turning against her, requesting to give the intruder, called Jason, a lighter punishment. However, Pera's next words caused Luna to calm down a little bit, allowing her to set aside her prejudice against men and not let her emotions affect her rational thinking too much. "I think the youth is really talented. His knowledge is not that vast, but his talent in all 3 basic auxiliary occupations should be extremely high. He is still in his teenage years, meaning he is still in his prime to learn. I didn't think of taking him in as an apprentice, but now that you say it, he is interesting and seems different to him." Hearing Pera's words, Luna's interest in figuring out who the young man was had increased further. Yet, this interest was more inclined towards how she could prove to the others that the intruder was just like every other man, a liar and vile. As such, she wanted to nitpick and find even the tiniest flaw so that she could punish him without restraint. Nobody knew what had really happened to Luna to hate men so much. Even small boys were not left out of her hatred, and the only exception were the double-awakened male manners Jen would save once in a while, who would escape her wrath. However, Their existence was only accepted as long as they followed Jen's orders, and would never even dare to approach the City Lord. They were far enough from her reach, to never encounter her, either. Thus, driven by the thought of revealing Jason's evil nature, the City Lord actively released her mana currents, only to jump up from her seat, the moment she sensed where Jason was. Rage flared up within her as she growled. "He is inside the library." Hearing this, Pera's eyes widened, and even the others couldn't help but feel astonished as they were already enveloped in Luna's mana. Only a moment later, they appeared within the first floor of the auxiliary tower as they rushed down into the basement. There, she saw that Jason was already standing, having noticed the arrival of the City Lord as he bowed to her. "Hello, esteemed City Lord, my name is Jason, and I'm sorry for the intrusion, it was not intentionally done." This simple sentence and the Celestia aura Jason released while smiling innocently at Luna were already enough to extinguish the flame of wrath within the City Lord. Taking a deep breath, the City Lord had the urge to squash Jason into a pulp, but at the same time, she didn't want to stain the books and the spotlessly clean floor of the library with his blood. Because of that, she decided to voice out the question lingering on everybody's mind. "How did you find and enter the library, and what did you plan to do?" Her voice was ice-cold and filled with anger, which was completely different in comparison to the icy-looking Eos, whose personality was cold, but rather emotionless. The question caused Jason to feel a little bit confused, wondering why the City Lord was so adamant to pin him to wrongdoing and think that there were certain things he shouldn't know yet. "I was told that I can use everything the way I want, so I entered the library and started reading a book. Was that not included? I wrote down a few questions too, if that helps to show that I didn't plan to steal anything." This caused the tall blonde-haired woman to look oddly at Pera, with a faint trace of anger visible on her face. "So, you didn't lock the library again, and now the intruder was able to enter it?" Hearing this, Pera stiffened before looking pitifully at Luna and was about to say that she had locked the door when Jason intervened. "The doors were locked, but I could easily open it, and I'm not an intruder, more like a victim of my own stubbornness against purchasing a city guide, I guess." Averting her attention to Jason once again, her eyes bore into him, and the disgust and anger in the City Lord's eyes caused him to flinch. Instinctively, he looked to the ground, trying to prevent the woman from killing him in the blink of an eye. "Maybe I should just learn how to shut my mouth when it's necessary," he thought, only to feel that the piece of paper on which he had written down his questions had been snatched out of his hand. Taking a glimpse, Jason noticed that the City Lord read his first question, only to stop right after that. "Are you serious with such a question? Either you really don't know the answer, you are stupid, or you lied to us beforehand. How can someone, who has been praised by Pera as having the potential to become a good blacksmith, ask such a stupid question?" Jason gulped down his saliva as he saw the anger in the City Lord's eyes, making him wonder if she was normally like that, or if she was simply having a bad day. However, in the end, this didn't matter because the wrath radiating towards him was scary enough for Jason to be afraid. It was the first instance in a long time that he had felt fear, and he couldn't help but think that the situation was slowly escalating. And all of that seemed to have ignited after the City Lord had read his first question. I should have written the follow-up question in the same line. Cursing himself in his head, Jason wanted to say something to justify his first question, only to notice that his lips had just been sealed by mana as the City Lord began to read his first question out loud. Chapter 634 Theory by Hydesgrain. As Luna read through the first question Jason had written down, she felt a surge of anger erupt from within her, which she could barely control. It took all her self-control to not get up from her seat and hit Jason then and there. If fire and ice attributed Tanardan ores of the exact same quality, grade and quantity are used to forge, will the weapon have the ability to manifest both affinities, or will the repulsive affinities and properties not allow the formation of an alloy between these two ores? If they reject each other, what can be added into the alloy to allow a successful amalgamation? The final answer was obvious because it was simply not possible to create an alloy out of the two Tanardan ores if they had opposite attributed affinities. Staring daggers at Pera, who was not sure what had happened in the time she had left Jason alone, Luna's anger was slowly transferred to Jason. She was fuming and spoke through gritted teeth. To think that I really wanted to lower your punishment. I don't care whether you're a god, variant, or halfling, wasting my time and enraging me is not something anyone should do. The rage infused into the tall woman's voice and mana currents was slowly seeping towards Jason, who could barely breathe. Even if the woman in front of him seemed to be exaggerating, he knew that it would be worse to add more fuel to the fire. As such, he could barely release a thread of his mana to transmit his voice. Second question. The voice transmission didn't even go through fully because Luna terminated Jason's connection, only to look straight into his eyes. There was not even the slightest trace of fear in his eyes, which was odd, considering that he had enraged a being at the Spectre stage. As such, Luna decided to read further and her eyes flitted to the paper in her hand again, but this time she read it in her head instead of reading it out loud. She was not sure why she did so, but something was odd about the youth, whether it was his aura or stigma she couldn't tell. Will adding a Lana orb be enough to negate the repulsive properties and affinities of the fire and ice attributed Tanardan ore, which is exactly the same in rank, quality, and quantity, or will it only change the properties, creating a water-attributed weapon? After reading the second question, Luna's anger slowly receded, and she retracted some of her mana. He had made her curious and now she wanted to know more about him. As such, she unsealed his mouth to let him answer her doubt. Why should the Lana orb be suitable to negate the repulsive energies of an alloy created by the fusion of a fire and ice attributed Tanardan ore? The City Lord didn't even look at Jason anymore as she handed Pera the piece of paper on which he had written down his questions. He was not sure about the exact answer, but considering that the City Lord gave him a chance to speak, Jason decided that he had to give his best effort. I read that the Lana orb can absorb the energy released by transmuted energy fluctuations. As such, I thought it would absorb the fire and ice properties that are naturally released by the fire and ice Tanardan ore. After that, it should slowly help them to adjust to each other, so I thought it might serve as a catalyst to create an alloy with which you can use both the fire and ice affinity without any interference. It might be a little tricky, and require the support of runes that consistently improve the durability of the ore, but I do not know that. Despite not being a high-ranked blacksmith, Jason's knowledge and understanding about the subject was anything but shallow. Luna could tell that Jason was interested in the topic. This was not difficult to tell, but when her eyes flicked at Pera, she saw him stare weirdly at Jason and didn't know what was going on. Is he talking utter garbage, or is his theory plausible? Hearing this question made Pera fumble as she was not sure of the answer herself. However, to her relief, she had noticed that Luna had calmed down a little. Even though she didn't trust Jason, this was different in the case of Pera and the other women. From the logical point of view, the theory Jason has in mind shouldn't be possible, but if we were to be honest, it shouldn't be possible to have a holy and darkness affinity seed within the mana core either, and we have multiple such cases here. With the last few words, Pera hinted towards Jen, who had the holy and darkness affinity within her body, but she was also hinting towards the City Lord, who seemed to have a darkness and fire affinity too. As such, there were not one but two examples of repulsive affinity beings around her which she mentioned indirectly. Earlier, Jason hadn't dared to take a proper look at the City Lord, and it was only now that he stole a glance at her. She was tall, had long blonde hair, and was gorgeous. However, what Jason was unable to tell was whether the City Lord was a human, or belonged to another race. One of her eyes was silver-white in color, while the other was a dark brown, while she had both a holy and a darkness affinity within her mana core. Thus, he couldn't help but feel that the City Lord was more of a human than anything else because she simply looked like one according to her appearance. Carefully listening to Pera's words, the City Lord nodded her head, and before she could even avert her attention back to Jason, he had already mustered the courage to say something. If I'm allowed, I would like to demonstrate something. It's about the fire and ice theory I mentioned, only if that is fine. he was still not sure how to talk to the City Lord or the others who were quietly standing behind her. However, seeing the spark of anger suddenly flare in Luna's eyes, Jason realized that he shouldn't have spoken right now. "Did I allow you to speak?" she asked coldly, to which Jason replied by shaking his head. It was annoying to be treated like a school kid, but he had to follow the City Lord's rules right now. He didn't want to offend her yet again after she seemed to have calmed down a little bit. Jason tried to look anywhere but in the direction of Luna, and simply waited for the City Lord to say something, only for several minutes to pass without anything happening. An awkward silence filled the library and the women behind Luna only exchanged glances when Jen slowly mumbled, "Master, just let him show you what he wants to show. You can still decide what you want to do afterward. It's not like someone at the Lick stage can run away from a powerhouse at the Spectre stage." Turning her gaze Jennifer, Luna saw her disciple smiling dryly at her as Pera added, "If he'd wanted to harm us, the entire library would have probably been on fire by now." No sooner had the words left Pera's mouth, she noticed how stupid she had been to remind Luna of her big mistake. As expected, Luna's anger was unleashed once again as her voice rang through the library loud and clear. And whose fault would it be? Taking a step back, Pera bowed lightly, apologizing before giving Luna a hesitant smile, knowing that she had messed up. "All right, just show me what you want." When the City Lord finally paid heed to his request, Jason felt a heavy weight lifting off his chest as he sighed in relief. Yet, just as he was about to open his mouth to say something, he shut it again, recalling the City Lord's earlier anger when he had spoken without permission. "Just speak, it's not like you cared about that before." Hearing this, Jason couldn't help but blink his eyes as he stared at the City Lord for a moment. "She is quite a diva, ain't she?" This was something he had to remember, but instead of thinking about it any further, Jason spoke. "It would be best if we leave the library for this. I don't plan to burn down this place like Pera said." Chapter 635 Approach by Hydesgrain. There were many things Jason could have wanted to demonstrate, but it was relatively easy to determine what exactly he aimed for. At least, that was what he assumed. After all of them had walked outside the library, the City Lord looked at him with a stoic expression that looked like she was not certain about Jason's intentional intrusion anymore. Seeing this, Jason smiled, thinking that he might have a good shot at avoiding being punished. However, rather than being focused on that, he couldn't help but think that it was more important to make his demonstration as neat and clean as he could. "Because I couldn't read much about the Lana Orb, given the short amount of time I was inside the library, I'm not exactly sure if it would work as I assumed. Nevertheless, I hope I can show that my theory works. In total, I want to show 3 things. First and foremost, I want to know if it might be possible to use the Lana Orb to create something like this." Saying this, Jason created an icicle in one hand and a black-colored fireball in the other. They were moving around his hand and arm independently, without obstructing each other, even if he were to use more mana for one of the 2 manifested affinities. The mana that circulated through his veins, transmuted by the activated affinities, could pass each other, which Jen noticed with a faint nod, as she could do the same, while the City Lord could now be certain about Jason being unique. As such, he was either from an extremely unique race, a variant, or a halfling. In the end, they knew that he was a halfling, but that was not the reason for him to be able to manifest a fireball and an icicle at the same time. Rather, it was his soul world and the fact that it had allowed him to bind Artemis and Solaris to his soul, transferring him their affinities. Now that he had revealed his ice affinity that seemed much worse in comparison to the extraordinary black flame, the City Lord only focused on Solaris, wondering what kind of flame it was. There were multiple possibilities, but the most likely was that it was a higher origin flame, which caused the City Lord to look at Jason in a new light. How was he able to procure this flame? If he never encountered someone at the Ascendion, or Spectre stage before, this should be something impossible to procure. Did he lie? Questioning Jason once again, the City Lord's expression hardened, but before she could say anything, Jason quickly revealed the second thing he had wanted to demonstrate. terminating his connection with both the conjured fireball and icicles. He took only a moment before a few blazing icicles manifested between his hands. Despite a low-temperature flame inside each of the icicles, they didn't melt owing to the faint amount of mana Jason consistently inserted into them. Seeing what Jason was doing, the others grew interested and focused all his attention on him. While observing him intently, they understood that his mind was not only focused on using two affinities at the same time, independently, but also together, to amplify each other. Shooting the blazing icicles into the air, he ordered some of them to explode, releasing thousands of ice shards, while the rest was instructed to shatter the icicle's mantle, revealing the flame itself. The latter was something Jason had already done years ago because he had wanted the flame to fly in a straight line for a slightly longer time, without being influenced by the wind currents that would slow down and extinguish a normal fireball. Witnessing Jason's demonstration, the City Lord's anger slowly dispersed because she realized that the answer to the simple question she had read was more complex than one would think. For the last demonstration, Jason had to concentrate a little bit more as he had to use his fusion with Artemis. However, in order to not reveal the fusion at all, Jason retracted his stigma and aura completely, while preventing even a single body part of Artemis from manifesting on his body. This was harder than he had expected, and he noticed that controlling the fusion by only allowing it to change specific things was difficult to achieve. Fortunately, after a few minutes, only parts of his hair were dyed in a silver, almost white color, while Solaris accepted the change that came forth with his and Artemis fusion. Turning sky blue, the black fire affinity turned into the frozen fire which he summoned without hesitation, releasing it in one hand. The surrounding temperature decreased within moments. The others had noticed that parts of his hair changed their color, while the image of a second stigma had manifested above his naturally formed stigma. This had already caused them to look at Jason in curiosity, only to see and feel the frozen flame. Looking into the sky blue flame, they were not sure if Jason was playing with their mind. While they were still confused by his ability, he further elaborated. From the logical point of view, the frozen flame shouldn't exist, but you could, in fact, call it a fusion between two of my affinities. It can only be conjured by doing something rather special, and I wondered if the Lana orb allows two repulsive affinities to work similarly. If I understand the few pages I read correctly, the third demonstration might be a little difficult for it to achieve, but it's not impossible. Meanwhile, the first and second demonstration I did should be capable of creating a weapon that was forged with an alloy of two repulsive attributed ores. While Jason finished his demonstration with a short statement, the others only looked at him with conflicted expressions. Releasing Artemis from his mana core's thread that had initiated the fusion, he also allowed her to leave the mana core, making her return to the soul world. Thus, he returned to his former self, only for Jen to blurt out, "That's crazy." After that, she averted her attention to her master, only to see that she was looking at Jason as if she was feeling the same as Jen. "Master, do you think it's even possible for us to control our affinities to the extent at which the holy, or darkness affinity accept each other, similar to how Jason's ice affinity was accepted by his black flame?" This was an important question, but Luna didn't answer her disciple because she couldn't hear Jen. Her entire focus was on Jason, and the sky blue flame that was slowly reverting to the black flame it had been before. Only after a few minutes and Jen tugging at her master's clothes did the City Lord move, looking around at what was going on. This caused the others to smile faintly while feeling as overwhelmed about Jason's frozen fire as Luna did. However, Jen was more interested in the answer to her question, which she repeated a second time, only to hear an answer she didn't want to listen to. Forcefully initiating an acceptance of two repulsive affinities should be close to impossible, if I were to speak about it in logical terms, but there are so many things I do not seem to know that you might have to try for yourself. Your body is different from mine, and it should be easier for you to achieve such a feat. It might take a few years, but, maybe, it's possible for you to make your affinities accept each other wholeheartedly. As for me, I think my affinities are already too strong to let them get to know each other by manifesting them at the same time, together, while testing out all kinds of things. If I were to try it now, the entire manor would probably explode. While you can test it out, you should experiment carefully with someone else around to help you if something goes wrong. I doubt it is as easy as Jason makes it look like. Jen was disappointed with this answer, but Pera heard something interesting, so she quickly intervened. Luna, did you just call him Jason, instead of an intruder? You don't think that he intentionally intruded your abode anymore? Chapter 636 Punishment by Hydesgrain. Luna, did you just call him Jason, instead of intruder? You don't think that he intentionally intruded your abode anymore? The moment the city lord heard this, she regretted her choice of words and bit her tongue. Glaring at Pera, who smiled lightly, Luna only said, "You shouldn't be concerned about this youth's punishment anymore. Rather, be prepared for yourself. Who allowed you to leave a stranger alone, in the auxiliary tower at that?" Luna was enraged, but that was only obvious because many things could have gone wrong due to Pera's carelessness of leaving Jason alone in the auxiliary tower. As such, Pera's smile was washed away as she paled. However, knowing that she had done something wrong, she could only nod her head meekly, accepting her fate without complaining. Meanwhile, the city lord turned to Jason, only to look into his golden silverish eyes as she sighed. He is way too foolish to be an intruder. How can he easily expose his secrets to complete strangers? These words caused a faint smile to emerge on the other women's faces, only for Jason to feel slightly offended. Despite that, it was great that the city lord didn't think of him as an intruder anymore. Thus, he simply ignored Luna's comment and smiled at her. As for your punishment, there shouldn't be a need for that. You exposed your secrets, and you didn't really do anything bad, to begin with. However, if you want to leave my abode, you will have to make a soul pact that will prevent you from exposing the existence of Jen, whose identity you seem to have learned with your unique eyes, as well as the other things you have heard. What Luna said was reasonable, and Jason nodded his head, happy about what he heard, only for the city lord to continue speaking. If, and only if you want to stay a little bit longer in my abode, you will have to make a soul contract, which prevents you from lying to us. That shouldn't be much of a problem, and if you don't want to say something, you can simply state that instead of answering forcefully. By staying here, you could become Pera's apprentice for the time being. Her appraisal of your talent should be correct, and it shouldn't be disadvantageous if we nurture you a bit. Jason's eyes grew wide to hear the city lord because he didn't expect to receive such a grand opportunity. It was much better than he could have hoped for in the beginning, where he had to fear being executed on the spot. From fearing for his life, he was now suddenly being welcomed under their wing where he could grow and learn. The city lord's sudden change in behavior was weird, but at the same time, not that unordinary, because Jason was sincere with everything he had been saying or doing for the entire time. In the end, it would have been weirder if Luna hadn't noticed his sincerity, because that would mean she truly hated men, without differentiating between them, at all. Nevertheless, Jason couldn't help but ask. If I were to stay and become Pera's apprentice, am I allowed to leave the auxiliary tower, or do I need to avoid encountering you? It doesn't look like you adore the sight of men, that's why I'm asking. He hoped that his words didn't offend the city lord, but instead of the expected rage, she almost chuckled before she replied. I think it's fine if you walk around my abode. There is no need to confine you to the auxiliary tower. You are just a brat and not a man, after all. Jason stiffened when he heard this, and he could only question himself why the city lord was suddenly trying to attack him with words instead of her strength. Nevertheless, he decided to remain silent for a moment, overcoming the painful words of the city lord that hurt his pride a little, only to look her straight into the eyes. If that's the case, I would be honored to learn new things from Pera, and if possible, improve my knowledge in other fields too. Maybe, I can even spar with the other cadets I heard about too. I don't want to neglect my cultivation progress, and combat training either. He knew that he had yet to acquire a suitable martial art technique to improve his combat prowess once again, but that was not as important as constantly fighting against others, possibly stronger opponents, to prevent becoming outdated. If possible, Jason would prefer improving his knowledge and proficiency with the 3 basic auxiliary occupations a few days in the week, while cultivating late at night, only to use the remaining days to rest and hone his combat skills. This should be feasible, considering that he was allowed to walk around, and from the looks of it, the City Lord didn't seem to have something against it. As long as you sign the soul pact that prevents you from lying to me, Jen, Pera, and a few more I trust, you can do whatever you want. Luna's attitude towards Jason had completely changed, which was nice to see. However, at the same time, it was a little bit weird, and he couldn't help but feel odd, only to see that the others' reactions were not any different either. Jen looked at Luna as if she was doing something shocking, while the 3 guards couldn't help but furrow their eyebrows to hear the decision. Meanwhile, Pera was rather happy about the outcome of the entire situation, except for the fact that she had made a big mistake. She won't reduce the funds for the auxiliary tower, right? Pera suddenly questioned herself, with a shock, only for her to quickly put on a neutral expression, in an attempt to prevent Luna from noticing what she was thinking. A few moments of silence passed because nobody was sure what to say as Luna chose to sort out the mess once and for all. Pera will explain everything necessary to you, and she can also set up the soul pact. There is no need for me to do that as long as the content of the soul pact is correct. Jennifer is in control of the cadets you were talking about, so you will have to ask her for permission to spar with others there. I also heard that Lanro is the first city you entered after leaving your origin planet. As such, you shouldn't have a messenger emblem yet. Pera will take care of that too. Taking a glance at Pera, Luna only saw Pera nodding her head before swiftly dragging Jason back into the auxiliary tower. Let's go into the tower, I can explain everything to you there. It's much quieter too. Using Jason as a means to avoid being punished, Pera quickly disappeared, leaving behind the City Lord, who was smiling faintly, only to hear Jen ask. Master, are you sure that it's fine for Jason to be here? Don't you dislike all males, whether young or old? Maybe I'm mistaken. However, seeing how Luna shook her head to come up with a proper answer, Jen was even more confused, only to hear the answer she hadn't expected. He is interesting, whether it's his capabilities, cultivation stage, the strength of his mana fluctuations that are several times stronger than his cultivation rank, or his proficiency in the auxiliary occupation. In the end, his entire existence makes me feel as if we should try to either kill him right now, thereby preventing him from growing further, or be on friendly terms with him. Chapter 637 Thirsty by Hydesgrain. Establishing the soul pacts that prevented him from lying to certain individuals as well as exposing Jen's identity was not difficult and quickly completed. Jason didn't even know much about Jennifer, to begin with. As such, it was pretty difficult to expose something he didn't completely know himself. However, what he knew was already more than enough to make the Eosantavir race act against the City Lord, despite her extremely strong cultivation base. At least that was what Pera said, only to explain everything about the 3 races' culture, tradition, why there were so many variants and talents in the City Lord's abode, without a single ordinary servant, and much more Jason was just beginning to know. In the end, the seemingly simple explanations took several hours, which was totally unexpected for Jason. Even Pera hadn't expected this, but Jason's list of questions seemed to be never-ending, and the more she explained the more doubts he had. While being curious was a good thing, it prevented her from neatly summarizing everything. Under normal circumstances, this would have been enough, yet, with Jason's endless thirst for more knowledge, she was forced to provide exhaustive explanations to even the less important things. Owing to that, Jason understood almost everything clearly, which wouldn't have been the case with a short summary. It was the first time for him to enter another planet with intelligent races if one were to exclude the broken world that was only a part of a destroyed world. Knowing very well that his fundamental knowledge of mana and its inhabitants was shallow, Jason wanted to get a refresher course. He wished to expand his knowledge while getting to know the basics which he hadn't asked Alsnars and his students when they were traveling together. After a few hours of explanations, Jason received a small dark green colored card with a unique looking emblem engraved on it. Using his emperor eyes, he noticed that there were thousands upon thousands of runes, inscribed into the few millimeter thick card. There were several layers of sheets put together with each of them overflowing with runes. This was extremely interesting, and according to the information he had received, the emblem was that of the City Lord. It was a crescent moon, while the card itself was the commonly used messenger with which one could communicate with others who knew the necessary contact information to call each other. Jason felt that this card was comparable to a highly upgraded version of the quantum bracelets, which allowed him to be able to quickly learn how to use it properly. A few contacts were already saved in the messenger card, which was also called Lunarium by those around the City Lord. These contacts were necessary for Jason to know if he wanted to get around the city without being forced to rely on others, and they included everything Luna found important to have saved in the standard version of her People's Messenger card. She had included everyone with enough authority to decide something when she herself wasn't around, and contacts like merchants, shops, and other necessities he would most likely require. Thus, to put it simply, the messenger card was like a small heaven to Jason, who could simply call a merchant to bring him the materials he required. This made Jason happy, and it prevented him from going out to shop, allowing him to forge, concoct and inscribe runes until he was sick of it. Pera noticed his joy, which made her forget about the City Lord's inordinately favorable behavior towards Jason. Instead, she simply continued to explain all kinds of things, while stating a few rules he had to pay attention to. The rules weren't hard to remember because one who had some basic etiquette and common sense would fare pretty well in abiding by them. As such, Jason felt weird hearing rules that warned him to not peek into the rooms of others, or even near the small hot spring the City Lord's manor had. Despite the weirdness, Jason couldn't deny that it was also funny to hear such rules before he turned serious again. After the basic rules, Pera switched to the explanation of the dangers he had to face, now that he accepted staying inside the City Lord's abode. Because you are one of the weakest individuals inside the manor, you might be attacked by Eos, Devere or even humans the moment you leave the abode. Luna might be the City Lord, but that doesn't mean everyone respects her. Rather, the Eos and Devere race are trying to shackle her down by making her the City Lord, pinning her to the administrative affairs, and not letting her leave the city without anyone noticing so that they can wreak havoc on the barren lands, fighting for sovereignty. You've heard about the cadets before, and there are also some who are weaker than you, but you won't find them in the manor, neither are they connected to Luna nor inside the Lanro city, at all. As such, be careful of where you go, and what you do. Others might not directly find out about your existence and connection with Luna because you're a male, but that will change once someone sees you leaving the abode, alive and uninjured. Initially, Jason was under the impression that Pera was exaggerating, however, seeing how serious she sounded, he couldn't help but gulp down his saliva. Great opportunities are definitely not something I would receive without having to face dangers, it's not like I didn't know that. With that thought in mind, Jason accepted everything rather easily. Digesting all information, his mind that had already been refined several times was rattling, only for him to look at Pera, the moment she was done explaining something for the North time. She was parched after hours of speaking, yet Jason was far from done. Nobody answered the possibility of my earlier theory of utilizing the Lana orb, with a certain answer. Does that mean it could theoretically work out, or was I too far-fetched? As Jason effortlessly switched between listening to the necessary explanations right to asking Pera questions related to the 3 basic auxiliary occupations, the young-looking woman who had already lived for hundreds of years couldn't help but stare at Jason. Will he always be like that, filled with questions to the brim? Maybe. That is the punishment given by Luna. No. That can't be, or can it? Whether it was intentional or not, Pera felt obliged to answer Jason's question, only to realize that she had never thought of using the Lana orb for something as extraordinary as combining 2 repulsive attributed Tanardan ores with each other and creating an alloy. As such, she couldn't answer the question with certainty herself and fumbled, saying that it could work if they were to experiment with it. Unfortunately, Tanardan ore is expensive, and finding a fire and ice-attributed Tanardan ore with the exact same quality, quantity and amount should not be worth the effort to search, let alone the high price for such a unique order to purchase them. Furthermore, the price of a single Lana orb is not cheap either. Maybe we should start with the basic training and slowly advance ahead before starting with experiments like the one you mentioned. That's fine, right? Pera tried to minimize the wastage of funds as much as possible, and Jason, who was just about to take out the Tanardan ores and elemental crystals he had acquired to state that he had more than enough funds and ores to experiment with, halted in his tracks. Maybe I shouldn't be too wasteful with the materials I acquired in a duration of more than a month either. Even if he thought so, Jason's thirst for knowledge and his desire to find out if his theory held any ground seemed endless. Nevertheless, Pera's words were certainly true, and it was best to freshen up his skills and proficiency with the 3 basic auxiliary occupations first. After that, he could acquire wealth with which he could fund his own experiments. He didn't want to use the City Lord's funds that were spent in the upkeep of the auxiliary tower for personal use after all. Chapter 638 Customization Plan by Hydesgrain. After Jason had walked out of the City Lord's grasp relatively unharmed, more than a week had flown by without any unique happenings. The library below the auxiliary tower had become a haven for Jason, who hadn't left it since entering. Determined to increase his knowledge, he had used the messenger card several times a day to ask Pera questions about something that flashed through his mind, or if he didn't understand something. Pera, who had her own set of responsibilities to look after, was unable to do so properly as she received a call every few hours. Thus, she had been forced to do something that didn't demand too much attention from her, making it possible for Pera to answer Jason's questions without any hindrance. Jason didn't know that he was distracting Pera to such an extent, but at the same time, he knew that he would ask her these questions even if he was aware of her busy schedule. In the end, Jason was even allowed to cultivate inside the library, which came as a pleasant surprise. With the energy density within the room, he had assumed that it was necessary to preserve the old books and tomes, but that was not the entire truth. Apparently, every subordinate of the City Lord had learned how to read in full focus while cultivating. It was imperative to use every second in one's life to the fullest extent, which was why Jason also tried to make it possible. Actively cultivating in the balance of the universe cultivation technique while reading was difficult, but now that a week had passed, he was slowly getting the hang of it. However, now that he had been inside the auxiliary tower for an entire week, Jason was eager to figure out more about the City Lord's abode, its unique places, and even more importantly, where he could spar against the other cadets. Jason felt the itch to fight, and with the 3 soul bonds idling around him during a whole week of silent reading and learning, they had been visibly annoyed at him. In the beginning, Jason had been a little bit worried that Solaris would accidentally set the entire library on fire, but after he controlled the temperature of its flame, the little origin flame couldn't even heat up the wooden table that had only been a few centimeters away. Meanwhile, Artemis and Petri in their small form had nagged at Jason, pulling at his clothes, telling him to go out and fight others so that they would have more fun too. At the same time, Artemis reminded Jason that he had promised to revamp the interior of his soul world, once he had enough soul energy. This threshold had long since passed, and Jason felt a sudden urge to customize his soul world as he recalled his promise. I completely forgot about it. Jason could only think apologetically, transmitting it to his soul bonds while stating that he would soon change everything. There was not much for him to do right now, except becoming stronger, increasing his proficiency with all 3 basic auxiliary occupations, and so on. As such, he could easily spend a day or 2, customizing the ginormous soul world. Jason was not sure how exactly it would work, but with what he remembered about it, he had to bind everything to his soul, even the smallest molecule of soil, pebble, and water, as long as he wanted it to be part of his soul world. This was interesting and gave him a huge variety of possibilities to change the entire soul world into a small world in which his soul bonds could be happy. In the end, they were bored quite often, which was given considering the fact that they were three completely different types of beings and not compatible to play with each other very well as they would do with other beasts or even brethren. Thus, without being able to permit unbound beings inside his soul world, Jason knew that his soul world needed a major overhaul. He even asked himself if he should bind a few low-ranked beasts just to make his world a bit more entertaining, but that brought forth disadvantages he didn't want to bother about. As long as he didn't have the intention to bind soul bonds to make them his family, Jason didn't think that it would be wise to waste his precious soul threads. If he wouldn't care about binding huge numbers of soul bonds, how should he pay attention to them without accidentally turning his soul world into a field of predators hunting the prey? God forbid, if his soul bonds were to ever start killing each other, his entire soul would turn into a bloody mess. Never let such a ghastly phenomenon occur was a taboo, so he had to pay attention to his soul bonds existing in harmony. Another challenge he would face was feeding thousands of beasts every now and then if he were to follow the path of mass binding beasts. It would be too annoying and cumbersome as he couldn't simply throw the food into the soul world without binding it to his soul. There might be a few changes in his soul world once it merged with his vessel at the Ascendian stage, but until then, Jason couldn't know what exactly it would entail. At the same time, he would have to use the information at hand to make the best out of his current situation because he couldn't waste his time worrying about the future every single time. This was only logical because the present was a prerequisite to living in the future. With that thought in mind, Jason left the library with his 3 soulbounds clinging to him. While Artemis and Petri went to the usual places on his shoulders, Solaris had once again changed its shape, trying to perfect the golden-eyed black flame dragon it had often shaped its flame into. However, now, the flames were at an extremely low temperature and it almost looked like Solaris had become a miniature dragon because one could barely see the flames flickering. Walking around the City Lord's abode, he didn't immediately enter the manor as he wanted to familiarize himself with the other places first. At the same time, he had to call the security to announce that he was now walking around with 3 beasts and that they were neither intruders nor hostile. He should have done this earlier, but the library had specific runes that prevented the security team, or to be precise, the energy radar from perceiving beings inside it. Thus, he had only now revealed his soul bonds without saying anything specific about them. Even if someone asked, Jason would just say that they were his companions and that he could send them away owing to his soul awakening. Other than that, there was not much he would have to explain because the City Lord told him that he could remain silent if he didn't want to answer something. As such, Jason didn't worry about it right now. Minutes morphed into hours and before he knew it, it was already dark when he completed his short tour around the City Lord's abode. Now that it was dark, Jason didn't feel like searching for or calling Jen, only to find the cadet, which he incidentally hadn't found, exactly as Pera had told him. Instead, he took out one of the few books Pera had given him, in which Jason could find a list of all kinds of merchants and items they were known for selling. In addition to that, there were a few common things every merchant sold, which made him take a proper look at every single item, including the prices that were the most frightening. Even the mana-infused soil is expensive, do I even need that? He suddenly wondered, only to realize that he had never tested how it might work if he were to bind certain plants that created mana or other energies to his soul. Through this, his soul bonds might even be able to cultivate inside the soul world, which would increase the efficiency at which he and his soul bonds could work by leaps and bounds. With that in mind, Jason could tell that purchasing mana-infused soil might as well be a good idea in addition to a few other seemingly ordinary items, only to recall something. I don't have any funds. With that thought in mind, Jason could only smile lightly, thinking that his customization plan had already failed for now. Meanwhile, his conscience accessed his spatial rings where he took a look at the elemental crystals and Tanardan ores. I should call the assistant of a merchant, to sell a few products soon, after I make them with the remaining inscription solutions. Chapter 639 First Step by Hydesgrain. With his mind set on his first proper task, and excitement coursing through his veins, Jason felt fully energized. he didn't want to return to the library or search for the cadets to spar against them at all anymore. Instead, Jason wanted to create strong weapons with which he could earn a fortune, before using it to customize his soul world. The thought that it was possible to allow his soul bonds to be entertained inside the boring soul world while being able to cultivate two, made Jason happy. This was mostly because his soul bonds transmitted their joy to him, making him determined to start working immediately. As long as his soul bonds were happy, he would feel the same. Furthermore, with the possibility to create a place for his soul bonds to cultivate, their strength would increase at a rapid pace, which would in return enhance his own strength too. As such, he had even more reason to figure out whether his assumption was utter stupidity, or if it held some ground. Thus, after he returned to the auxiliary tower, he entered the second floor where most tools to forge were situated. The basement had one more room other than the library, but Jason was not really interested in exploring it, while the first floor was relatively simple and jam-packed with stuff Pera didn't utilize often. Meanwhile, the second floor was the workplace for someone who wanted to practice any or all the three basic auxiliary occupations, while the topmost floor had multiple rooms to rest. Jason had visited the room allocated to him only once, but instead of sitting idle in his room, he would rather focus on other things. He had never really liked sleeping a lot, and being able to cultivate every minute allowed him to stay energized almost 24/7. Nobody could say for certain how much sleep someone at his cultivation rank required, but Jason simply assumed that once a week was already a lot. Personally, he didn't feel like sleeping for more than 2 weeks in most cases. Furthermore, with his interest rekindled, there was even less need to even think about sleep as he took out the preserved inscription solution, in addition to his inscribing pen which was formerly used by Dahlia. Jason thought of it as her heirloom and he wanted to try using it as long as he could until it would finally dull, rendering it useless. The potency of high-graded inscription solution would slowly corrode the inscription pen from the inside. Only a good inscription pen that had specific runes engraved on it while having been manufactured out of highly resistant materials would enable Jason to inscribe using specific solutions. Fortunately, the pale golden inscription pen of Dahlia was perfectly suited for his needs at the moment. Unfortunately, that was not the case with Shane's forging equipment that paled in comparison to the smithy, anvil, and other tools he saw on the second floor of the auxiliary tower. Pera had explained the perks and what he had to pay attention to while using them, some time ago, and it was evident that their value was tens, if not hundreds of times higher than Shane's equipment. This was sad, but Jason could only acknowledge this fact. Memories of his masters made him feel a little sad, but he only smiled ruefully before entering the auxiliary tower's warehouse, where he searched for a small box in which he could preserve the inscription solution much better than the spatial ring could. Jason didn't need anything else from the warehouse, and instead of wasting more time than necessary, he took out a few Tanardan ores that had the fire attribute within them. They were the only ones he could use with the similar fire attributed inscription solution having a similar fire attribute which he had already prepared. As such, he only had to forge the Tanardan ore into a suitable weapon into which he could inscribe the inscription solution. With this, he could increase his forging proficiency, as well as the accuracy with which he could inscribe runes. Before starting the forging process, Jason evaluated the forging equipment first, including the weight of the hammers, whether they had a unique effect, and what special features the anvil and chimney itself had. The chimney appeared to be ordinary at first glance and Jason immediately compared it to Solaris Flame. However, after placing the black flame into the chimney, this changed drastically as Solaris' abilities were seemingly enhanced to a certain extent. This was great and allowed Jason to speed up the forging process by a large margin. Heating up and expelling the impurities usually took the longest, but these processes were now accelerated. This caused Jason to be happy, only for Artemis and Petri to transmit their joy that was seemingly fake. Noticing this, Jason ordered the two soul bonds to enter the soul world, or he would postpone customizing it. Saying this worked wonders and they immediately left, while transmitting to him that he should stay true to his word. Chuckling, he finally was ready for a long day of work. Starting to forge, Jason decided to create a longsword which required one of the large batches of fire-attributed Tanardan ores he had at hand. Heating it up took a while, but the reduction process of the oxygen within the ore occurred faster than he could blink, leaving the raw metal behind. Seeing this, Jason smiled lightly, only to shake his head afterward. It seemed to be way easier than usual, but that was not problematic at all. Instead, it was extremely helpful, and Jason felt at ease as he took out the heated-up Tanardan metal. Using the medium-sized hammer he had found in the smithy, Jason used it while exerting the Hammer of Fire, Kyoldrum forging technique he had copied some time ago. He was far from perfect at utilizing it, and had at most learned the basics, but he was gradually improving. It was only a matter of time before he would become good enough to swiftly forge a great weapon that was further reinforced by the technique's uniqueness. Thus he enveloped the medium-sized hammer with a faint layer of black flames, in addition to the neutral mana that was consistently released by the hammer itself due to the runes inscribed on it. In the end, the runes inscribed on the hammer allowed Jason to put in less effort while exerting the same strength as if he was using a higher amount of physical force. This decreased the brute force he would need to utilize, but at the same time, it caused him to be more careful about the amount of strength he applied. He didn't want to destroy the mana veins that were intertwined with the other two veins, otherwise, he would have no option but to throw away the scrapped metal. While slowly shaping the blazing hot metal into a lengthy rectangular bar, Jason was already focusing on expelling as many impurities as possible, as it would take the longest to cleanse the whole Tanardan metal of every single impurity. From the looks of it, there were more impurities in the ores with lower quality, and even worse, the positioning of the impurities within low-quality ores was extremely bad too. As such, Jason figured out that higher-quality ores were simply better and convenient to forge and purify. Despite that information, Jason figured that he could simply sell high-quality ores, or barter them with the same ore of a lower quality, only to get more in return. Even if he thought like that, it was easier for him to say that he could easily purify the ores than actually do it. The entire process was more arduous than Jason expected, and it took him 3 hours before he decided to stop. He hadn't been able to purify the Tanardan metal perfectly, but it was already much better than his first attempt. Thus, having progressed, made him feel relieved, but Jason didn't want to be too full of himself. As such, he stopped purifying before focusing on completing the forging progress of the fire-attributed ore to the longsword. This took 3 more hours, and painstaking effort, but the final result was worth it. The bright red weapon was gleaming faintly as Jason inserted a faint trace of mana to test its capabilities. While the mana conductivity was great, the amount of mana necessary to manifest a red flame that instinctively enveloped the sword was low. It was greater than the amount of mana necessary with an innate affinity seed, but definitely not too taxing for anyone to use. This made Jason happy as he figured that he had forged a good weapon at the peak of the lick stage. Suddenly, as he was about to store away the longsword to make space for a new forging procedure, he saw something out of the corner of his eye that made him stop in his tracks. Did I just forget that I have a huge fortune sitting right in front of me? He thought while cursing himself as he looked at the bulk of manuals inside his spatial ring. Chapter 640 Mythical Grade by Hydesgrain. Seeing the small pile of manuals inside his spatial ring, Jason could only shake his head as his next thought was to immediately lament at his stupidity. I could have sold them already to gain a fortune to customize my soul world before starting to forge. But will the merchant give me the correct price, or should I test the auction house for this? After his first thought, he immediately questioned whether the merchant would bring him the biggest profit, which was unlikely to be the case. Nevertheless, knowing that quick cash was more important right now, Jason decided to sell the worst techniques he had at hand to the merchant, while leaving the terror, intermediate, and advanced techniques inside his spatial ring. Rather than worrying about losing out on too much profit, Jason wanted to sell them at the auction house, where many manners without an affiliation were searching for suitable techniques with which they could cultivate, refine their body, or increase their combat prowess through martial art techniques. Apparently, Even those with an affiliation were often seen browsing through the auctioned items in order to not miss the possible chance of finding an even more suitable martial art technique, or similar technique they could use. Thus, with his mind set in stone, Jason called the merchant assistant, who greeted him politely, without asking who Jason was. As such, his messenger card's contact details had already been saved, only for an awkward moment of silence to occur as the assistant heard Jason's voice. The merchant's assistant had been frozen for a second, only to take a second look at the contact information. He was astonished to hear a male voice through the call of a messenger card that clearly belonged to the city lord and her subordinates. This was shocking, but keeping up with his professionalism, the merchant's assistant tried to retain a calm mind. "How may I help you, sir? Is there something sir wants to purchase, barter or sell?" Jason noticed the confusion in the assistant's voice, but instead of bothering about that, Jason simply stated the reason for his call. "I want to sell several martial art, cultivation, and body refinement techniques at the Terra Basic grade, in addition to a peak lick stage weapon with the fire attribute that can be manifested by all 3 cultivation veins." Jason forgot the names of the weapons that could be used by all 3 cultivation paths, and it was evidently not the prefix mana, or soul. Thus, he could only state what his weapon could do, while making a mental note of asking Pera about the basic nomenclature for certain things. While Jason was in his thoughts, the merchant's assistant was already asking a few things, trying to figure out which appraiser they had to send out to evaluate Jason's goods and set the price they would pay. "How many manuals does sir want to sell, and is the weapon sir mentions a special grade weapon or a mythical grade?" It's not clear through the stated description. Not knowing what exactly those 2 grades meant, Jason just answered the first question while trying to talk around the second one. "There are less than 100 manuals I would like to sell, and the weapon I mentioned is probably something between the special and mythical grade. Unfortunately, I'm not exactly sure about the precise evaluation." The merchant's assistant went silent for a while before replying. "I just sent someone over to the city lord's abode. She will arrive in the manor and appraise everything. I hope this is fine with sir." After Jason stated his approval, the call ended. In the end, the entire call was completed in less than 3 minutes, but Jason could only exhale deeply once the assistant had hung up. With the messenger card in his hand, he called Pera, who was not inside the auxiliary tower anymore, asking her what the special and mythical grade the merchant's assistant had been talking about was. "The merchant assistant I called earlier said something about special and mythical grades, but I haven't read anything about that in the library books in the entire week." "Just what are those grades?" Pera had already been confused about why Jason hadn't called in the last few hours, but instead of complaining, she had just continued with her task, only to receive a call just when she had finished. "I assumed that you're already aware of the grading system of unique weapons. In the end, it's quite simple, and mostly one word as a prefix is added before the exact rank of the weapon is shared. As a matter of fact, the grading system just adds a little bit more details to the ranking. For example, a mid-lick ranked weapon might be well forged, and extremely powerful owing to specific characteristics such as the fire attribute of the dagger you forged when you arrived. However, on the other hand, it's also possible for a mid-lick ranked weapon to be ordinary, with nothing great about it except the material it had been forged with. Such weapons don't get a prefix, because they're deemed common. Special grade weapons are weapons that have, at least, one unique characteristic such as extraordinary endurance, sharpness, or other means that enhance the weapon above the standards of an ordinary mid-lick ranked weapon. Unique traits of a weapon are mostly gained through runes that have been inscribed, but that is not a trait the weapon gained innately. As such, they're called half-step special grade. By undergoing purification, metals change innately and become more endurable, while the blades made out of highly purified materials are much sharper. To put it simply, all weapons and tools made out of highly purified weapons are special grade because they gain at least one unique characteristic. As for perfectly purified goods, they're almost always called mythical graded ones, but that comes with the requirement that all 3 cultivation veins can use the weapon. In your case, with the elemental attributed Tanardan ore you've mined as well as your ability to purify them greatly through the origin flame you own, the final result will most likely be half step at the mythical grade, or already considered a mythical grade. This is, however, mostly owing to the unique trait the Tanardan ore has, which is its external usage of attributes, even if one cultivates in another cultivation path. The 3 cultivation veins inside the Tanardan ore are interlinked after all. Jason found Pera's explanation to be extremely helpful, and he thanked her before hanging up as he mumbled, "So every weapon I forge will at least be a special grade, if not mythical grade. That sounds quite good." Meanwhile, his Emperor eyes perceived the arrival of someone at the peak Prisma stage. The woman he saw was about to reach the manor, so Jason quickly left the auxiliary tower while releasing his mana to show where the woman had to fly to. She was an Eos, which made Jason wonder if it was a problem that he'd exposed himself to her. With that, he clearly showed that the city lord accepted his existence in her proximity as well as the fact that he was considered to be affiliated with her. Thus, he should be worried about his own safety, which was however not the case, because he could clearly see that there was no hue indicating danger around the Eos. The moment the woman saw him, she arrived in front of him, flapping her large white wings before she halted. "Hello sir, my name is Jewel, and I'm here to appraise the manuals and peak lick stage weapon whose grade is still unknown." She retained her professional attitude, and Jason simply nodded his head before entering the manor where they used one of the smaller rooms to appraise everything. Jason didn't even bother taking a look at Jewel, the Eos, and without wasting any time, he took out a total of around 100 basic grade manuals that had a wide variety of uses. Most of them belonged to the Ephrata race, and wouldn't be worth a lot, but instead of worrying about the exact price he would receive for the low-ranked techniques, his focus was on the longsword which he took out as the last object. It should be at the mythical grade, or is it just a half-step mythical grade because it's not perfectly purified? The grading system was extremely interesting because the price of a higher-ranked weapon was evidently a huge difference. If Jason were to compare it to ordinary mana and soul weapons, the difference in price should be even higher than that. As such, he couldn't help but look at the light red blade of the longsword before he handed it to the appraiser, who looked at the weapon with interest. A few minutes passed in which she appraised the weapon, testing out all kinds of things, only for her eyes to widen in astonishment. The weapon is not perfectly refined, and neither forged perfectly, but the forging process utilized seems to be close to perfection, and the forging technique used is interesting too. As for the inscribed runes, they're perfectly placed, amplifying their potency drastically. At the same time, they're suitable to enhance the fire-attributed Tanardan metal's fire, decreasing the consumption. To put it simply, the weapon is not yet perfect, but with a little bit of work, the person who forged this weapon can create a perfect mythical grade weapon. All in all, it's already a mythical grade weapon even without being perfectly forged. It will be quite valuable for younger prodigies of the Devir and Eos race who have yet to awaken an affinity, and are trying to learn how to use one. Hearing the evaluation, Jason couldn't help but smile brightly, which was seen by the appraiser, who eyed him for a moment. Did he forge it by himself? His cultivation rank is low, but his mana fluctuations are quite high. Still, it takes years to learn how to purify a simple ore to the extent to which the Tanardan ore, which is extremely complex, has been purified. This youth is way too young to have done that.